Western philosophy frequently treats the lack of an absolute, permanent foundation as an intellectual crisis. Without a firm, unchanging ground to build upon, the assumption goes, our systems of meaning inevitably collapse into nihilism or paralyzing anxiety. The Mahayana Buddhist tradition frames this exact lack of foundation as the precondition for human liberation. The Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, summarizing the core insight of the philosopher Nagarjuna, wrote that, thanks to emptiness, everything is possible. Emptiness, or shunyata, refers to the absence of a separate, independent, self-enclosed essence. It describes a reality that exists through conditions and relations, rather than through isolated objects. When modern academics and systems theorists encounter this interdependent framework, they reflexively categorize it. They look at a system where nothing stands alone and label it a relational ontology. Naming emptiness an ontology leifies the exact metaphysical certainty that the philosophy was designed to dissolve. Understanding Madhyamaka requires deconstructing this academic error through a dual-axis model of relational epistemology, which alters the mechanics of how we perceive change and possibility. This node represents svabhava, intrinsic essence. Western metaphysics relies on this concept to categorize the permanent furniture of the world. Nagarjuna applied the prasanga method, subjecting this assumed essence to opposing logical forces until it dissolves, leaving an empty center without a replacement structure. The prasanga method functions by dissolving essence talk. Nagarjuna stated that he held no position, refusing to replace one ontology with a new competing theory of what ultimately exists. Assigning the label relational ontology to Madhyamaka reimposes a rigid metaphysical box on a deliberately non-positional philosophy. Relational epistemology provides a more precise bridge term for Western academics. Relational epistemology stays on the side of how knowing is structured when the grip of essence thinking is loosened. It honors Nagarjuna's anti-metaphysical stance by making no positive claims about the furniture of the world. Replacing ontology with epistemology shifts our theoretical focus from asserting what reality is to observing how reality appears and is known relationally. We can plot the first dimension of the Madhyamaka framework on a horizontal axis. This is the structural dimension, known descriptively as non-self. Under the logic of non-self, an entity's identity is constituted entirely by its relations and conditions, rather than by prior intrinsic properties. This spatial axis maps to Western second-order cybernetics, where the observer is structurally implicated in the observed. Francisco Varela's inactivism built on this Nagarjuna thread, arguing that knowledge arises in the relation between the knower and the known, rather than as a representation of an independent world. This structural connection extends into physics through Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. Rovelli explicitly relies on Nagarjuna's denial of svabhava to argue that physical properties emerge only through interactions. This entire web of relations is synchronic. It represents a single snapshot of structural interdependence at a specific moment. Maps of structural interdependence show us how properties arise together in space, but a synchronic snapshot cannot explain how these relational webs actually move. While the spatial axis proves nothing stands alone, a static relational web is insufficient to explain transformation. This requires a second, temporal axis. We complete the model by adding the vertical axis, impermanence, which operates on the diachronic or temporal axis. Because there is no fixed essence persisting through time, the relational web undergoes constant moment-to-moment transformation. This temporal axis of ongoing becoming aligns with the Western tradition of process philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead viewed reality as an unfolding event rather than a collection of objects. Henri Bergson viewed time as a continuous, indivisible flow rather than a sequence of static states. Integrating the temporal axis explains why the relations themselves are always becoming otherwise. The human mind instinctively tries to grasp and hold on to rigid, permanent objects that reality simply does not contain. Impermanence acts as the mechanism by which a thing's relations are allowed to change and evolve, rather than serving as a form of tragic destruction. Western academics often misinterpret non-self as an ascetic demand to erase an existing ego. We can clarify this by contrasting Madhyamaka with Simone Weil's prescriptive concept of decreation. Weil defines decreation as an intentional act of will, the annihilation of the self to make room for external grace. Nagarjuna's claim is purely descriptive. If there never was a separate self to begin with, there is no intrinsic entity that needs to be annihilated. Recognizing non-self is a shift in perspective that removes the requirement for violent self-denial. Treating emptiness as a prescriptive demand for self-erasure recenters the ego by making it the target of destruction. Instead, true emptiness recognizes the self's inherently relational and fluid nature, ultimately freeing the entire system to continuously transform. Combining the axes reveals the generative architecture of reality. If a system actually possessed a fixed independent essence, transformation would be structurally impossible. This logic inverts groundlessness. The lack of an absolute foundation becomes the source of freedom. When we say that, thanks to emptiness, everything is possible, we are stating a literal logical causation. Change requires incompleteness. Because nothing carries a closed nature, no identity, institution, or system is ever permanently trapped by its current configuration. The absence of metaphysical certainty is the presence of ongoing possibility. We can apply this philosophical framework directly to high-level inquiry and human-machine interaction. When we treat the knower and the known as interdependent, we encounter the failure mode of the compromised mirror. This happens when an AI or a facilitator attempts to remain a neutral observer, repeating a user's existing insights back to them. Mirroring assumes a separate, static position that the philosophy has already dissolved. It reintroduces a separate self confirmed from outside the relationship. True relational inquiry introduces difference. It pushes gently on where analogies strain, rather than reflecting a fixed position. Engaging relationally means fully participating in a co-arising inquiry and dropping the demand for a separate, fixed standpoint. Because reality itself is unfinished, our ways of knowing must remain open, refusing the comfort of final answers to keep the future possible.